So we are very grateful for the Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers for initiating this campaign and sponsoring us, this event. I'm a member of the Upper Valley Affinity Group, I should have said. So the issue before us is a grave one, with great consequences for Vermont and beyond, that people just need to know about so they can oppose it, hopefully. But mostly now we welcome our speakers who came out here tonight, traveling long distance. Colonel Rosanne Greco and Dr. Ira Helfand, Rachel Siegel, and Don Grazier. We're grateful they're giving their time and sharing their expertise and insight with us tonight. They will each talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a brief panel discussion amongst themselves. After that, there'll be time for question and answers. We are honored to have our friend and CAN BVT advisory board member Chiho Kaneko here tonight with us. She grew up in Japan and traveled frequently back after the Fukushima disaster to be with her family. She has a deep insight, a deep understanding of the impact, the devastating impact of nuclear power on all of life, uncontrollable when unleashed. So I'm glad she could be with us. And now I have Jennifer Decker, the campaign organizer, introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Ulrike. Thanks to all of you from the Norwich area and beyond for coming out tonight to hear this presentation. I'd just like to say a few words about Dr. Ira Heflin before he gets up to speak. He is a co-chair of Physicians for Social Responsibility's Nuclear Weapons Abolition Committee and also serves as co-president of Physicians for Social Responsibility's Global Federation, which is the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Dr. Heflin has worked for many years as an emergency room physician and now practices internal medicine at an urgent care center. Dr. Heflin represents the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War at the annual World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates. He is also a member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons International Steering Committee. Dr. Heflin's co-authored Physicians for Social Responsibility's report, Nuclear Famine, 2 Billion at Risk, which outlines the global health consequences of a regional nuclear war. He was a leading medical voice in the international campaign against,
International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Thank you. We all make mistakes. And he addressed national delegations at international conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in Oslo, Norway, Mexico, and Vienna. During the May 2016 UN Open-Ended Working Group on Disarmament in Geneva, and throughout the UN General Assembly negotiations in 2017. I've been able to have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Heflin a few times during this campaign, and I'm very honored to introduce him to speak to you this evening.
Thank you. And I also want to thank you all for coming out tonight. We are talking about nuclear war, which is not a very pleasant subject. And I'm sure that all of you, in preparing to come here, understood that this was going to be a very difficult conversation we're going to be having. I am really pleased and honored to be able to be part of this campaign in Vermont to stop the stations of the F-35 here in the state. We need to understand that nuclear war has again become an issue that we need to attend to with much more energy than we have in the last 25 to 30 years. A generation ago, we all understood that nuclear weapons posed an existential threat to humanity. And as a result of that understanding, millions of people became politically active around this issue in the early 1980s. And remarkably, and important for us to remember, we brought about fundamental change in US and Soviet nuclear policy at that time. We were then in a nuclear arms race. We were headed towards nuclear war. Experts thought that the chances of our survival in the 1980s were less than 50%. And they were probably right in that assessment. But we did survive. And we survived because of the activism of millions of people around the country who insisted that we change our nuclear policy. We're in the same sort of situation again today. When the Cold War ended, we never thought this would happen. We thought we had put the danger of nuclear war behind us, but we didn't. Danger never went away. There were, thousands of nuclear warheads that remain, 14,500 in the world today. But in the last 4 or 5 years, that danger has ratcheted up dramatically for a number of reasons. US-Russian relations are the worst they have been in 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And the possibility of a war between the United States and Russia, which we were told just a few years ago is off the table. US government didn't even think about this. That possibility is real. The United States and Russia could get themselves into a shooting war, and that could escalate to nuclear war. US-Chinese relations are the worst they've been in 40 years. And there is a military component to the rivalry between these two great economic powers. US and Chinese ships punching in the South China Sea on a regular basis. And this is a disaster waiting to happen. One can easily imagine something going wrong, and that escalating into armed conflict. The situation in Korea is, again, in the news, as it ought to be, because it was never really resolved. We have to remember that a year ago, just before the summit in Singapore, most experts thought the United States and North Korea were on a collision course towards a nuclear conflict. That danger passed a little bit. It got papered over in Singapore, but the underlying issues were never addressed. And as we can see now, the problem festers and the danger is there, and we don't know what's going to happen next in the Korean situation. The most dangerous, I think, of all the potential flashpoints between nuclear powers is in South Asia, an area which gets almost no attention here in the United States. But India and Pakistan are both nuclear armed. They've gone to war 4 times since they became independent in 1946. And if there is a 5th war, this will be a nuclear war. The military doctrines of both Pakistan and India are well known. They're matters of public record. And if there's a war between these 2 countries, Pakistan will use tactical nuclear weapons to offset the conventional superiority of the Indian military forces, and India will retaliate using strategic weapons against Pakistani cities. This has enormous implications, not just for people in South Asia, but for us, as I will describe in just a few minutes. And this situation is extraordinarily volatile. There was a near miss just 5 weeks ago in fighting on the border, and for 2 days, we stood on the brink of nuclear war again, and came back from it. But only in a temporary, partial sense. The underlying issue in Kashmir has not been resolved, and the potential for conflict between India and Pakistan remains great and frankly growing. There are 3 other factors that we need to worry about. Climate change is making all of these conflicts more dangerous. It's intensifying the situation. And as climate change progresses over the next few decades, as large areas of the planet become unable to support their populations, the pressure on countries will grow, the chance for conflict will grow, there will be forced migration on a scale we have not dreamed of, and if nuclear weapons are on the table, there is a growing chance that those weapons will be used. We have to worry also about cyber terrorism, the possibility that terrorists can hack into the command and control centers of our nuclear weapons, and either cause them to be launched directly, or cause one or the other of the nuclear weapon states to believe that it's under attack, and launch its weapons in response to that. And finally, just at the moment, and I hope this will be a relatively transient problem, is the Trump factor. And I say this with some trepidation. I do not think this should be a partisan issue. Democrats and Republicans share an interest in eliminating the danger of nuclear war. But we have an unfortunate situation in this country that must be acknowledged at this point. Our military and other government leaders have said for decades that it would be intolerable for even a single nuclear weapon to fall into the wrong hands, by which they meant a rogue state or a terrorist group. We have turned 6,800 nuclear warheads over to Donald Trump, who, in the estimation of the security experts in his own party, lacks the judgment, the temperament, and the knowledge to command a nuclear arsenal. This is not what the peace community is saying. This is what scores of Republican security experts famously said in an open letter during the 2006 campaign. And it's an assessment that has been echoed by his first Secretary of State, who called him, quotes, a moron, in specific reference to his understanding of the nuclear issue, and his first Secretary of Defense, who called him an idiot in the same context. This is a very dangerous situation that we have created, and we have to own it. We have put an enormous nuclear arsenal in the hands of someone who is impulsive, ill-informed, and not particularly empathetic. Shall I say it that way? So we have an extraordinarily dangerous situation. What's going to happen if these weapons actually get used? Most of us have a notion that nuclear war is very bad. We use the phrase, it will be the end of the world, to describe this. It's important for us to understand that doesn't really describe what's going to happen. That phrase is used to sort of put this issue aside, to put it on the shelf, to not face what's going to happen. Because what's going to happen is horrible beyond our imagining. I don't have a lot of time. I just want to very briefly describe what we know about limited nuclear war. We used to think that it would take an all-out war between the United States and the Soviet Union back in the 80s to be a threat to all mankind. What we have learned in the last decade is that a much more limited war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, would also be a disaster for the entire planet. Studies that were done about a decade ago showed that if India and Pakistan used just 50 Hiroshima-sized warheads on urban targets on each other, those 100 warheads would kill 20 million people in a week. But even more horribly, they would cause worldwide climate disruption because millions of tons of soot would be wafted into the upper atmosphere, blocking out sunlight, cooling the planet, drying the planet. And as a result of that climate disruption, there would be a catastrophic decline in food production across the entire world. And as a result of that, there would be a global famine, which we had estimated would put up to 2 billion people at risk of starvation. Now that study was done more than 10 years ago, and it's in the process of being updated this month, looking at the way things have changed in South Asia since then. The populations of the cities have grown, the piles of combustible material have grown, the arsenals of both countries have grown dramatically. And the new study, which will be released in a few months' time, shows that everything that we said 10 years ago was true, but it's much worse. The death toll directly in South Asia could be as high as 130 million people, not 20 million people. And the disruption of climate could be 2 to 3 times greater than we thought it would be a decade ago. So what we need to understand is that even a very limited nuclear war, we're talking about the use of less than 0.5% of the world's nuclear arsenals, a very limited nuclear war would cause a famine unprecedented in human history, and the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to think that our own very complex, fragile economic system, on which we all depend, would survive a disruption of this sort. So we need to understand that nuclear war is no longer something which we can ignore. We have to concern ourselves with this issue. And nationally, a campaign has been built called Back from the Brink to try to build a new consensus across the country about what U.S. nuclear policy should be. And I'm happy to talk about that later during the question period if people are interested. Here in Vermont, there's a wonderful vehicle for people to take action and to try to bring about a change in U.S. nuclear policy. And that is this campaign to stop the F-35. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heflin. I now have the pleasure of introducing Colonel Roseanne Greco. Roseanne retired honorably after 30 years of service in the U.S. Air Force. She specialized in strategic intelligence and arms control. She was a U.S. delegate to 4 international arms control negotiations, including the Strategic Arms Reductions Treaties, START, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaties, Standing Consultative Commission, which is the SCC, the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, and the Missile Technology Control Regime. She worked with the United Nations officials in New York City on peacekeeping and humanitarian affairs, and she has served as a city councilor and the chair of the South Burlington City Council. I just also wanted to add that Roseanne has been really instrumental in establishing the Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont campaign and has been inspiring audiences around the state for a long time. So without further ado, Roseanne.
Does this work or no? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to try this. Okay. So if you can't hear me, raise your hand. I'll keep eye contact with y'all. This evening I'm going to share with you some of what I learned as an intelligence officer specializing in strategic nuclear weapons and nuclear war planning. I held the highest security clearances. One of my duties was involved with the preparation of the highly classified document called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, called SIOP. This is a document that the president would get that gives him a range of nuclear options, describes launch procedures, and lists targets for our nuclear bombs. Much of what I did and know is still classified, and I obviously can't talk about that. Rather, I'll give you unclassified information in lay terms, as best I can, about how aspects of nuclear targeting relate to the risks that Vermonters run by basing the F-35 nuclear bomber in Vermont. I'm looking across the audience, and I don't want to insult anybody, but I would guess that young people here, have never talked about nuclear weapons, much less nuclear war. For those of us who are a tad bit older, it's probably been decades before since we ducked and covered under our desks to protect ourselves from a nuclear bomb. So I'm going to preface my remarks with a brief explanation of strategic nuclear weapons. So if you all know a lot about nuclear weapons, just raise your hand and I'll just run through and... Okay, so I don't see any hand raised, so here we go. The U.S. and the big nuclear powers maintain a triad of strategic nuclear weapons. These include the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles called ICBMs, the sea-based submarine-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles called SLBMs, and strategic, or sometimes called heavy bombers. Each leg of the triad has advantages and disadvantages. Our ICBMs are based in underground silos. The doors are super hardened and are very difficult to destroy. But since it's really just a hole in the ground, they are a small target. But ICBMs are all fixed targets, and our enemies know exactly where they all are. Our SLBMs, sea-launched ballistic missiles, are inside submarines. Our enemies know where all of our submarine bases are located, but it's much harder to find the submarines once they are at sea on patrol. SLBMs are considered the most survivable leg of the triad, and therefore are most likely to be used in a retaliatory nuclear strike. Our strategic bombers carry cruise missiles and gravity bombs. Until the recent inclusion of the F-35, we had only 2 other strategic bombers, the B-52s and the B-2s. Our enemies know where all our bomber bases are, and bomber bases are a very easy target to destroy. However, bombers are the only leg of the triad that can be recalled in flight and prevented from deploying their nuclear weapons. In contrast, once an ICBM or an SLBM is launched, it cannot be stopped. Depending on the location of the target and the location of the attacking nuclear weapon, intercontinental flight times can be as short as 10 minutes or as long as half an hour. So these are our strategic nuclear weapons. Now I'll cover how we plan to use them. And that brings us to MAD. MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. The MAD theory holds that if one country launches a nuclear strike, it would prompt a retaliatory nuclear strike, which then could lead to a massive exchange of nuclear weapons. This would result in the annihilation of both the country attacked as well as the country initiating the attack. The theory further holds that if nations know that they risk annihilation, they would be deterred from ever using nuclear weapons. They call this strategic deterrence. However, for the MAD theory to work, 4 criteria must exist. First, each side has to have a second strike capability, meaning the country that is attacked must be able to retaliate with nuclear weapons. Since ICBM silos and bomber bases will likely be the first that are struck, the survivable leg of the triad are the nuclear missiles on board the submarines. Second, each side has to have perfect nuclear launch detection capabilities, which report instantly when a launch occurs and identifies the exact location from which it was launched. There can be no false positives, meaning the detection equipment cannot interpret a naturally occurring event, such as a meteor, as an incoming warhead, or a flock of geese as a bomber. Third, each side has to be defenseless against an all-out nuclear attack, meaning neither side can have enough anti-ballistic missiles or any other way to block or destroy the hundreds or thousands of incoming nuclear warheads. And parenthetically, that is what the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was about, but that treaty's been ripped up. And fourth and lastly, each side has to have rational national leaders. That's MAD. I think you've heard about the Chinese. I'm going to now talk about nuclear targeting strategies and how they flow from MAD. The specifics about how nations choose targets for their nuclear weapons is highly classified, but I can share with you 3 of the tenets of nuclear targeting which are applicable to the F-35 and to Vermonters. The first tenet has to do with what is attacked first. There are 2 major categories: the nuclear delivery vehicles and the bases at which the delivery vehicles are located. Nuclear weapons arrive via delivery vehicles. Our nuclear delivery vehicles include the boosters, which carry the warheads on the ICBMs, the submarines, which carry the SLBMs, and the bombers, which carry the cruise missiles and the bombs. To better understand this, think of guns and bullets as an analogy. Bullets need guns to reach their target. Without a gun, bullets can't kill. So the gun is targeted, not the bullets. Where the delivery vehicles are based is equally important. If the runway is gone, the bombers can take off or return to reload. Moreover, bases are large, fixed targets and are relatively easy to find and destroy. The second tenet has to do with which delivery vehicles and bases to attack. That's simple. All of them. All delivery vehicles and bases are targeted. Were countries in short supply of nuclear warheads, and I can assure you they are not, then they might have to pick and choose which target to attack. They don't have to do this, as there are more nuclear warheads than there are targets. Ergo, everything is targeted. Delivery vehicles and bases are struck first. The third tenet has to do with basic nuclear targeting planning assumptions. Nuclear targeteers always worst case it. They assume every nuclear delivery vehicle is capable of engaging in a nuclear attack. Okay, now let's relate this all to the F-35 in Vermont. There has been a lot of speculation about whether our F-35s will have a nuclear capability and be assigned a nuclear mission. Since both of these decisions are not required to be released to the public, Vermonters will likely never know, just as Vermonters didn't know the last time that the Vermont Air National Guard had a nuclear mission. In the 1960s, when their F-89 fighters were upgraded with a nuclear capability, the Vermont Air Guard acquired a nuclear mission. Our Vermont Air Guard has had many changes throughout the years. Military missions change all the time. Earlier today, when we testified before the Senate committee, we had an individual who flew on the F-89 and told about the nuclear weapons being uploaded and told about being scrambled to attack an incoming Russian bomber that luckily turned back before they got to it with their nuclear weapons. Our politicians are trying to assure us that Vermont's F-35s won't ever carry nuclear weapons. Their assurances are meaningless. The Department of Defense can and will change military assignments to support national needs. But from a nuclear safety perspective, it does not matter what our politicians think. They cannot change the enemy's nuclear target. The Pentagon announced that the F-35 is now part of our nuclear triad. The Department of Defense talk about the F-35 as a first strike nuclear weapon. As such, it becomes a huge threat to our enemies, and that makes Burlington an even more important target. If the enemy is conducting a first strike on us, or if they are retaliating immediately after our first strike on them, they will worst case it and assume that all F-35s could participate in a nuclear attack. They cannot afford to miss any nuclear threats. It will not matter whether, in fact, Vermont's F-35 have a nuclear capability or a nuclear mission, much less where the nuclear bombs are stored. The enemy will strike the bomber base with force. All F-35 bases, including ours, will be targeted. In the event of a nuclear conflict, our survival will be determined by what the enemy thinks. Given the uncertainties and the catastrophic consequences, if we lose this mad gamble, our politicians are insane to continue supporting basing the F-35 in Burlington. Nothing is worth that kind of risk. So this ends our nuclear targeting session. I hope it was understandable. Given my background in nuclear targeting and nuclear war planning, I now view basing the F-35 in Vermont from an entirely different perspective. And I'd like to lastly share how this affects me personally. I've lived near nuclear targets throughout my entire career. I had no choice. In a weird twist of fate, one of the factors that went into my decision to retire to Vermont was my knowledge of what was targeted in the United States. Until the F-35 became part of the U.S. nuclear triad, I felt I was finally living in one of the safest places in the country. So the decision to base a nuclear bomber in my city is a cruel irony. If we are not safe from nuclear weapons in Vermont, then where are we safe? It's stomach-turning to think that Vermont, of all the states, will house a nuclear bomber. Should an irrational national leader decide to launch the nuclear weapons that he's talked about wanting to use, the unthinkable could happen to us. Truly, this is madder than mad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roseanne. I would like to now introduce to you Dan Brazier. He's traveled to visit with us from Washington, D.C. He spent 10 years as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. During his time in the service, his deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan taught him how to evaluate weapons and equipment for their true military value. As a graduate student of military history at Norwich University, right down the road in Northfield, he knows the F-35 program is already a disaster of historic proportions that will only get worse in the future. The Center for Defense Information, a nonpartisan watchdog organization, has spent decades exposing the waste and abuse that all too often accompanies Pentagon weapons programs. Here to talk more about that is Dan Brazier. Thanks, Dan.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here today to provide you with a little bit of information. I'm going to start off by giving the caveat that I gave to the senators this afternoon down up in Montpelier. I'm not here to tell you what you should do in Vermont as an outsider, particularly one from Washington. I think that'd be pretty inappropriate. So I'm just going to provide you some information that could help you as you go out and engage with your lawmakers and decision makers here in Vermont as they make the appropriate decisions for Vermont. Because you have unique considerations. Unlike Colonel Greco, I continue to live, my home is in Ashburn, Virginia. And if you're familiar with the DC area, Ashburn, Virginia is about exactly halfway between Washington, DC and Mount Weathers, which means that if the bombs falling on Washington, DC don't kill me, the ones falling on Mount Weathers will. Also, Ashburn happens to be the hub of the internet. 70% of all internet traffic travels pretty much right underneath my house. And so I'm pretty sure that Ashburn's probably targeted as well. So I don't want to duplicate too much what Colonel Greco said about the F-35 and how enemy targeters will go after the gun and not just the bullets. I know that a lot of the people on the other side of this issue in Vermont, to include particular senators and the National Guard Bureau, are trying to deflect this issue and tell you that the F-35 is not going to be a nuclear platform. I can tell you with absolute certainty that the F-35, when it was still just sketches on the back of a napkin someplace, was conceived to be a dual-capable aircraft, meaning that it was designed from the very beginning to be a conventional weapon and to operate with nuclear weapons. So anybody who's trying to tell you that the F-35 is not a nuclear bomber is lying to you. Now, the F-35 currently does not have that capability, and this is an important point that we didn't bring up in Montpelier. So the F-35s now do not have this capability. Right now, we have an earlier basic combat capability variant of the F-35 called Block 3F. The F-35 has fallen so far behind schedule, and the design has lagged so much that they actually haven't gotten around to designing the nuclear wiring, basically adding the capability to the F-35 to carry nuclear weapons. So I think it would be very ironic, but again, our potential adversaries don't know that, or they know this, but they're not going to take that chance. So they're still going to bomb every place that has an F-35. So I think it would be very ironic if Burlington were to be targeted by enemy nuclear weapons to destroy a target we haven't gotten around to designing nuclear capabilities into. That's just something to pay attention to and be mindful of. That capability is going to come about within the next decade or so. Now, with the way the F-35 program has progressed so far, I actually have my doubts about that. It will probably even take longer. So this is all part of the $10+ billion modernization program that the F-35 is going to go through in the next 10 years or so. And which is, in and of itself, is a pretty interesting thing. We've currently already paid for the basic design of the F-35. Like, all of this was supposed to be completed back in 2012, actually. And so we've already paid all of that, but now we're going to have to pay Lockheed Martin and the other contractors again to do the exact same job. So there you go. That's your tax dollars at work. I can also assure you that, and again, if anybody tries to tell you that the F-35 is not a nuclear bomber, you can bring up the B-61 Mod 12 bomb. That is a nuclear, the nuclear gravity bomb. Load it up in an aircraft and you open the bomb bay and drop the weapon. The Mod 12 version of the B-21 or the B-61 is specifically designed to fit inside the weapon bay of the F-35. It has really no other purpose than that. That is the entire reason why they're designing this. And this weapon has been described by some as the most dangerous nuclear weapon in history. And the reason for this is pretty interesting. It's designed to be a variable yield bomb, meaning that they can crank it up to full power and it would be 50 kilotons, which is approximately 3 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. They're very big explosive. Or they can dial it back to 0.03 kilotons. And it's what a little nuclear bomb, what some people call a tactical nuclear weapon or a battlefield nuclear weapon. And it's that smaller yield size that makes this such a dangerous weapon. This is the weapon that that military leaders could tempt a president under pressure to use in the wake of some kind of emergency. And the situation that I explain is, imagine everybody in this room was alive when September 11th happened. Okay? Big dramatic event, and we had a president who was under a great deal of pressure to show a strong response. Well, in 2001, we didn't have a little nuclear weapon to use. So we had to use conventional weapons in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, in the next couple of years, we will very likely have this small nuclear weapon that could also be used in that kind of a situation. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because like Colonel Greco said, our adversaries do not differentiate between a tactical nuclear weapon and a strategic nuclear weapon. To them, a nuke is a nuke. And so, and our adversaries have good reason to do that. We have a very odd perspective because of our geographic position here in the United States. So we have space because we're separated by 2 very large oceans from our potential adversaries. Well, the Russians don't have that kind of space. So we think, Americans think in strategic terms, we think in terms of 3,000 miles, the distance across the ocean, or at least across the Atlantic, is a lot farther over the Pacific. So we think in those kind of terms. Well, the Russians don't, because their potential strategic opponents are not just the United States, they can also be in Poland, they can be in Germany, they can be in China. They're next door neighbors. So this is why they have a very different perspective than we do. This is a very difficult point to get across to the defense intelligentsia in Washington, because I hear these kind of things, people in Washington, in the national security community in Washington, they have a very kind of homogenous view of the world. And when I bring issues up like this, about the geography issue that the United States has, they think it's ridiculous, and they think, because for some reason, they think because they all think alike, they think that all of our potential adversaries think alike, and that's a very dangerous thing. And it's a point that cannot be made enough. Again, I don't want to duplicate too much what Colonel Greco said, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I do want to talk a little bit about, again, talking about Washington, because that's the perspective that I have. The issue of threat inflation and the issue of our times being more dangerous now than they have been for a long time. There's a lot of truth to that, but you also have to be careful about that, and we have to be careful about not playing into that narrative too much. Some of my colleagues have done a big study of defense budgets over the last 70 years, basically since the end of World War II, so a little bit longer than that. And what we found was a very consistent pattern in that time of if you plot the level of defense budgets adjusted for inflation across time, so year by year you have a line graph, you'll notice that the trend of the increase of those defense budgets over that time is 5%. It's very consistent. Now it kind of veers, but the mean of the increase is 5%. And you can correlate when you look at the dips in that line, when it dips below 5%, you can correlate those dips with talk about increased strategic threat around the world. And we were actually in one of those troughs from about 2011 because so far President Obama actually owns the largest defense budget in history. So from 2011, which was the biggest one, it dropped. It went from about $711 billion, and then it dropped down to like $500 billion for a couple of years. So it was this big drop, and that went under that 5%. And in that time, all of a sudden, the defense intelligentsia of Washington started making up this near-peer adversaries, and we have to prepare for global war against peer adversaries, and Russia and China, and increased tension, and all that kind of stuff. That is very useful for selling things like the F-35, selling things like the B-21, because all of a sudden, major decisions about these big, expensive weapon systems that are only useful in a kind of war that isn't even theoretically possible. There is no such thing as a shooting war between the United States and Russia and China. If we go to war against Russia or China or any other nuclear-powered adversary, the cost of not doing so is so high that it goes nuclear instantaneously. So it's very important to be careful with your rhetoric when we talk about things. I usually don't mention Russia and China in the writing that I do, in any of the talks that I give. I'll talk about potential adversaries, and I do that for a very specific reason, because it's important that we don't feed into some of that, because there are people who want to take advantage of it for a lot of nefarious purposes. And when I'm saying nefarious purposes, I mean transferring massive amounts of money from the U.S. Treasury to the coffers of the defense contractors in and around Washington. Yeah, I think that's about it. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dan. I'm now going to introduce Rachel Siegel from the Peace and Justice Center. And Rachel has shared with me that her first encounter with the Peace and Justice Center was when she was in 10th grade in 1985, when she rode a Peace and Justice Center bus to Washington, D.C. to protest the U.S. military involvement in Nicaragua. Rachel was also involved in the nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s. 28 years later, in 2013, she was hired at the Peace and Justice Center. Between those years, she helped to start a radical cheerleading squad, an abortion fund, and programs to teach carpentry to middle school girls. She got sober, she did AIDS activism, protested corporate globalization, and worked to address racism in the schools. She taught pelvic exams to medical students and served on the Burlington City Council as a Progressive Party member. She continues to explore her identities as a class-privileged, cis, white, Jewish, queer, witchy woman, and she uses her social location as strategically as possible in her anti-oppression and pro-peace work. She gardens, keeps chickens, and chops wood, and she's been blessed with her fabulous partner Jules and their children Gertie and Ira. As a mom, she feels a depth of connection to the power of the earth and all of life that can't be explained in words. In the past decade, she's learned to love baseball, coached Little League for 4 years, and saw the overlap of economic justice work with sports in the Old North End, Burlington's most racially diverse and poorest neighborhood. She continues her spiritual practice with daily prayer and meditation, creativity and laughter. By working with others to create a movement of movement, she keeps hope alive. So I'd like to welcome Rachel to the podium.
That was a really long bio. How are you all doing? It's kind of heavy. Ira warned us, right? You didn't come here thinking it wouldn't be, but I'm definitely feeling the weightiness of it right now. And I'm not going to make it light, but I do hope that I can bring some hope to this movement so that we don't get paralyzed, because I think the weightiness can do that to people. Maybe not to you all, you're the ones who show up, right? But there's a lot of people who don't, unfortunately. So thank you to the Upper Valley Affinity Group and Ulrika and to the UU for hosting and to my fellow panelists and to all of you for being here. It's really a wonderful opportunity. Do folks know much about the Peace and Justice Center? Are you aware of our existence? I see some. Okay, so we've been around 40 years, and I'll tell you the beginning story in a minute, but the current story is that we do racial justice work, fair trade work, and nonviolence and anti-militarism work. We support a lot of different activists and activist groups around the state, and we help to develop new activists when we work with a lot of interns. We're based in Burlington, so we've got access to lots of college students, and we do what we can to train them up. If you want to know more about us, I brought some newsletters that are out there. And on the page 3, there's actually an article by James Ellers, who's the campaign manager for CAN BBT, about this campaign. So you can grab a newsletter on your way out if you're interested in knowing more about the Peace and Justice Center. We are a statewide organization, and at times we've had more of a presence statewide than we do right now. About 50% of our work is in Chittenden County. But we want to get out more, and so if you ever hear about stuff we're doing that you want here, please be in touch. We just need a little bit of motivation. As long as there's a couple people on the ground who want us, we'll show up. So, I'm actually going to pass around this sign-in sheet. If anybody wants to get on our email list, it gives you a good opportunity to see what kind of stuff is on it, so that if you're doing things, you can also give them to us to put on our e-news. We have a calendar that we keep, and we advertise a lot of other people's work, so I encourage you to make use of that. If you're doing stuff, let us know, and we can help amplify what you're doing. Okay, so 40 years ago, when the Peace and Justice Center started, it started as a peace coalition doing anti-nuke work. So, same stuff we're doing now, slightly different time. In 1981, the Peace and Justice Center helped lots of communities around the state declare themselves nuclear-free zones at town meeting day. So we all have been to town meeting days. Anybody live here in 81? Okay, so 17 towns declared themselves nuclear-free zones that year. In 1982, an additional 160 did the same. So in those 2 years, 177 towns out of 192 Vermont towns and cities signed on. Like, people in Vermont know what's what. And in 1982, they had the biggest anti-nuke protest in New York City that there's been. Any of you go down to it? Okay, thank you. So there were over 2,000 marchers. We apparently had the biggest per capita representation out of any state. right? That is really cool. Clap for yourselves. That is really awesome. It started in Vermont? The nuclear freeze, yeah. And it took off, and Reagan listened, right? We don't have, some of us don't have great memories of Reagan, but Ronald Reagan did listen to that movement, that the people nationwide saying, this is nonsense, get a grip. He slowed down the manufacture and he started dismantling some nuclear weapons. It was effective. People power works. And I think that, I don't know, we can speak up and we can say nuclear weapons need to be abolished, right? Like everybody agrees that here they should be abolished. But probably everybody here feels a little hesitant to go say that at the grocery store or at the post office because it sounds kind of radical or ill-informed or pie in the sky. It just sounds kind of out there, right? Like, how's that going to happen? But that's how we thought about landmines. They could never be abolished. That's too big. Or biological warfare. Or chemical warfare. And what happened when people organized? They were abolished. Like, it isn't pie in the sky, it's actually doable. We actually can do it. And Vermont has been at the forefront of things before. You know, the premise of this resolution, how many of you have seen the resolution that we're trying to get passed in the legislature? Cool. Okay, so the premise of it is to say we don't want nuclear bombers in Vermont. Now, obviously, as a peacenik, I don't want nuclear bombers anywhere in the world. But if we can say we don't want them in Vermont, then maybe Massachusetts follows suit, and maybe New York follows suit, and maybe there's a ripple effect, and we actually grow a movement, nationally and internationally, that can be effective. We saw this happen with marriage equality, right? We were way ahead of the curve in Vermont with health care reform. Not that we've mastered any of these things, but we have been, like, in the front, nudging people along. And I think that we can do it again. We just need to send a really clear message that we don't want them in Vermont and we don't want them anywhere. And that we know it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be quick, but we're in it for the long haul. And we just keep at it and we don't give up. So next steps, how many of you have signed a petition for CAM-BVT? Some of you have, some of you haven't. There's a laptop over there at the end. Make sure you go and sign the petition. It's very easy action. Has anybody called their representatives or senators about the legislation? Okay, a lot of you have. That is great. Have you forwarded an email to people asking them to do the same? Some people have. So there's a lot, there's like very tangible next steps we can do. Like, this isn't just some out there lark. It's possible. There's a couple more weeks. They had a hearing today in the Senate Committee on Government Ops, and they seemed warm to the idea. They didn't have discussion, they just listened. And they asked some questions. So we don't know how they're going to vote, or even if they're going to bring it to a vote. So Senator White, who chairs that, still needs more phone calls saying, thank you so much for having the hearing. Thank you for listening to people and letting them speak. Please call a vote. Because they need to vote on it for it to progress to the Senate floor. Meanwhile, Representative Stevens, is that right, in the House, has not had a hearing and has not called this, taken the resolution off the wall, basically. They're not addressing it yet. So he still needs calls also. You can also call your own representatives and pressure them to pressure the chairs of these committees. So you call your own representative. They're going to listen to you more than somebody else will, because maybe they know you personally, but they also know that they rely on the vote. And you say, hey, have you heard about this resolution to stop nuclear bombers from coming to Vermont? It's stuck in committee. Could you call the chair, go stop by and talk to the chair and let them know that your people want it taken up? So there are really specific, tangible actions that we can take to move this forward. And we can still get the resolution passed this session. It would be really, really exciting win. Yeah.
Stephen sent back a long list of reasons that he got from the military saying it's not a danger, it's not a threat, so he's playing authority.
And I wrote a point-by-point rebuttal of it. So I took what he sent out, which he got from Bernie Sanders' office in the Guard, and I did a point-by-point rebuttal. So if I get somebody's email or your all emails, I'll send it to y'all. What he put out, which came from Sanders and the Guard, is inaccurate, incomplete, sometimes totally irrelevant, but it's trying to look over there, you know, which has nothing to do with this. So, yes, he's hoping that we'll believe that stuff, but I'll send, and I also have source documents for everything, so you can check the government sources on it.
Thanks for sharing that. We'll definitely have time for more questions. I think Jennifer has a plan for how the rest of this is going to go, so I will hand the mic back over to you for that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for mentioning all the action steps. I'm not 100% confident of my internet connection here for getting folks to sign the petition, but does anyone have the sign-in sheet that we had been circulating? So if you don't mind, please continue. There's 2 sign-in sheets.
Oh, sorry, that confused
One
me.
there, we have the one. So the one, can you hold that one up? That clipboard was a retirement gift to my mom from her 2nd grade student. So when you get that one, if you sign on there, then I will make sure that you get all the information you need to sign the petition. And if you'd like to do it on your own, you can go to our website, look up the Take Action link, and go to where it says Become a Co-Sponsor. And there's another section on urgent action, and that is to please contact the House Committee on General Housing and Military Affairs and contact all the committee members and ask them to hold a hearing on our resolution. So it is very exciting what's happening in terms of the fact that the Senate committee did agree to a hearing, that it went well, but there still is a lot more to do. And we are also very encouraged by the fact that in South Burlington last night we had a conversation in the city council about introducing the same resolution at the town level, and we encourage other citizen groups to do that at the town level as well. So, and thank you for getting us focused on next steps and what can we do, because I think that brings more hope to the conversation. And the other thing I wanted to remind people of before the evening goes on too long is that we do have refreshments. We have Ben & Jerry's ice cream kindly donated by Ben Cohen, one of the co-founders of Ben & Jerry's, and lots of baked goods for people to enjoy. And another action step that you can take is this week, Thursday, on the State House lawn in Montpelier, we're having a 1-hour meditation. So there's 2 people who are meditating for a full 24 hours starting tomorrow at 3. Their meditation ends Thursday at 3. The rest of us are joining them Thursday at 2 to encourage and support the last hour of their meditation. And we'll all be facing in one direction, showing our strong opposition to the basing of nuclear weapons here in Vermont. And so I'm really excited to know that people are willing to come out and take really significant action and make personal sacrifices to help make the world a better place. And I know that we can make a difference because when I was a child, my father stood up and sued the Department of Defense. He filed suit against the head of the Department of Defense at the time, Clifford, and was successful in moving the anti-ballistic missile system that was being planned for Illinois at the time through various events. It didn't actually come about through the lawsuit. But earlier today we were talking about many states have actually stood up and said no. And we can do that here in Vermont. We have the historic foundation of communities all around the state standing up and saying no. The way that we build that movement is that we, as citizens, do the outreach, talk to our friends, talk to our neighbors, talk to our family members. And so if you want any support on how to do that, that's what my job is. I'm here to support any type of effort you'd like to make, whether tabling or hosting another event. But before I go on at too great a length, I just want to offer the opportunity now for the panelists just to discuss and dialogue amongst yourselves. Some of the things that you've all brought up might have raised questions for one another. I know that one of the things that Dr. Heflin talked about in a recent talk was about the process for dismantling nuclear weapons and how that works and how possible that is to do that. So that might be something that we can start with. But if you had other questions come up or points of emphasis that were raised as you were listening to the other speakers, I'd love to hear you just have a conversation amongst yourselves, and then we can share the microphone with the rest of the assembly to ask questions too. Thank you.
Let's just open the questions.
Okay. Very good. We'll just open up to questions. That's wonderful. So I'm going to just walk around, but before I do, I just want to call your attention really quickly with the action steps I'm talking about. There's a flyer for the meditation event and more details out there. And then this is an article that Roseanne wrote, and it has the action steps at the top that you can take. So please take a look for this one. It's called What You Can Do, a Call for Action.
So you can hear me. Why don't we start another nuclear freeze movement here?
Well, I also have to challenge some of the Vermont chauvinism. The freeze actually started in Western Massachusetts. And we have started another freeze movement. It's called Back from the Brink, and there are brochures about it on the table. And there's also a website, preventnuclearwar.org. I think that it's really wonderful what's going on here in Vermont, but I think it does need to link up ultimately to this national movement that is being built that calls for complete fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy. Most importantly, the United States to enter into negotiations with the other 8 nuclear weapon states for a specific, time-bound, enforceable, verifiable process for eliminating the rest of nuclear weapons in the world. And I don't think that this should be seen by us as pie in the sky or something which is unrealistic. This is what needs to happen. We have been living on borrowed time for the last 70 years. We know of multiple episodes where we have come within minutes of nuclear war. We were not safe because, as Colonel Greco said, we're not safe because deterrence works. We were safe because we were lucky. And sooner or later, our luck is going to run out. And we really, with great urgency, need to get this message out to people. And that's what this Back in the Brink campaign is trying to do. There's 4 specific interim steps that it proposes that people take, as well as the United States take, as well as the most important step of entering into negotiations with the other nuclear armed states. But I would encourage people to visit the website, pick up the brochures. Here in Vermont, 2 towns, South Burlington and Winooski, have endorsed this campaign already. Otherwise, actually, Vermont's a little bit behind the ball. In Maine, in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, it's been introduced to the state legislature. Many towns in each state have endorsed this already. So it'd be great for Vermont to take this up as well.
I'm going to add to that. And you've heard the phrase, think locally, act locally. We have we have the most local thing to do. We are in Vermont going to get the first operational F-35 Guard base with a nuclear bomber. We're going to be the first in the nation to get that. So that's in our backyard. So it's not that we are not trying to, think beyond that and get rid of all nuclear weapons, but we have the ideal opportunity to say no to the first one, and it's coming to Vermont. So that's why it's so important, to contact your legislators over and over again, respectfully, politely. This is a sense of urgency. You have probably heard of the doomsday clock. You all heard that? The Federation of Atomic Scientists, years ago, I heard of it, and then we never heard of it because we were doing arms control treaties and such. We are the closest to midnight we have been in the last 30 years. So,
Ever.
ever. not talking about nuclear weapons or nuclear war anymore. And we, unfortunately, we need to start talking about it. Because if we don't start talking about it, as Zara said, we have come so close. And there's going to come a time where our luck is going to run out. I think we have power in our voices. We have power as people. We underestimate our power all the time. Last night at the South Burlington City Council, there was a councilor saying, well, what can we do? You know, I mean, it's too big. They're going to come, each about the F-35. But what about nuclear war? Come on, you know. Wow. All right. And yeah, that's really sad. Just the opposite. Absolutely, we can do it. And you can start in Vermont.
Why did they choose Vermont as the first? Is it
Because Senator Leahy. Senator Leahy, I've been working on this now for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. And if you want to know a little bit, just a smidgen about it, the F-35 is coming here for a political reason. There is no military reason, operational military reason to base it in Vermont. In fact, when we went through the document, we sued the Air Force. Some of you may know that, all right? We lost. But as a part of that lawsuit, the Air Force was required to release all of their records. The federal judge asked for that. In that, we read, on at least 4 occasions, the Air Force was not going to select Burlington. They went through this process of evaluating 3 bases. 4 times. Why? Because they realized we were the environmentally worst place. Environmental means not just the natural environment, but the human. I mean, it was a socioeconomic impact, environmental impact, financial impact, health impact, safety impact, and so on. They did all, they said, whoa, this is the worst place for it environmentally. But then as they went on, they realized we were the worst place operationally. And I want to get into the details. And so they were going to pick another base. They were going to pick South Carolina. It's in their documents. And the Guard heard about that, called Leahy, and then Leahy pressured the Air Force to pick Burlington. That's why the F-35 is coming to Vermont, because of Senator Patrick Leahy.
Wow.
And it's documented. I'm not just saying, you can read it in the documents. He picked up the phone and he called the 4-star in charge of the Air Force and said there's a few people that don't want it, but the vast majority of Vermonters want it and I want it.
So we need to bombard his office then.
Pardon?
We need to bombard his
The
office.
man has ignored us for 7 years, right? Our state legislators are our last hope. If they speak out and say, we do not want it, the Air Force will listen. A lot of people also poo-poo that. They say, what power do we have? You know, it's a resolution. It has no legal merit. It doesn't. But it has a moral impact. And the Air Force will listen. Just 6 months ago, they asked Governor Scott, do you still want the F-35? Why would the Secretary of the Air Force ask the governor, does he still want the F-35 if we don't have a say? So let's get our say.
I respectfully disagree that this is the last hope. That the
well.
state legislature is the only way, and I do think calling Leahy's office still makes sense. I don't know how much inroads we'll make. He's best friends with my stepdad, and he won't talk to me about it. So he's stubborn on this one, but I don't, people can be stubborn and then they can change eventually if they hear from enough people. Who knows? I wouldn't say don't. I would say do, please.
Can I ask you a question about that, Rachel? I have a feeling that strategically speaking, that if we are able to galvanize enough people to take action to pass the resolution, that the timing of contacting Senator Leahy would be once we have the resolution. That would be when we can have the greatest impact, that we can use that for leverage. Would you agree with that?
I would say that if we could see the future and know that the resolution will pass, that makes sense, but we don't know that it's going to pass. And I think waiting till it fails and then calling him would be less effective than calling him now while it's in process. So I don't have a straightforward answer to that.
Now that Norwich is involved, I imagine we'll get a lot more of a groundswell. We have a few questions here.
Isn't Leahy's wife part of the Alamo real
Yes.
estate?
Yes, she is.
Yes,
Well,
she
it's
is.
really, it's business is at the bottom, because real estate is some of the most prosperous
Yes.
enterprise.
She's what?
She's part of the Pomerleau real estate empire in
Yeah.
Chinton County. And I think when we talk with them about that, we have to say, say, well, you know, is this because your wife is part of the real estate empire? Right?
Yeah, he's been asked, and he doesn't engage. Yeah, and so for clarification, there's a family, the Pomerlows, in the Burlington area, very wealthy, sometimes philanthropic family that is in the real estate business. And Marcel is a Pomerlow. And so there's a lot of real estate dealings that happen, like getting rid of the houses that are around the airport because the noise is too loud, and so now they can have business development there instead of housing, and so there's financial opportunity. That might be a piece of it. There might be a lot more behind the door stuff going on in DC than we know. Not sure, but it seems like there's a good chance that's part of it.
So also,
Yeah, you can take
as part of some study I've done about the financial impact of the Pentagon budget on Vermont, it's beginning to appear to me, I've interviewed some of the so-called remnants of the precision industries in Vermont. There's two of them right here in this area. One of them employs 300 people, very high-paying jobs, and guess what they make? They make parts for the F-35.
Oh, here?
Yeah, right here in the area. There's another small one that does also, but it appears to me that underneath all this, if it weren't for the Pentagon budget, we probably wouldn't have a precision industry in Vermont.
I just wanted to, I'm a former U.S. Army officer as well, but a big campaigner now against war and against imperialism and so on and so forth. And I was at a big meeting in November, and that's the first I heard of it. I heard of it in Ireland, when I was meeting with activists in Ireland, and from Italy, from Japan, and it was a bunch of anti-war activists, and they said, oh, you're from Vermont? And I just moved to the area last year, and they said, did you know about this? I said, I had no idea about this. And so this has gotten out to the much wider anti-war movement globally that know about it. There were some campaigners from Italy, from Japan, Okinawa, that are doing a lot of campaigning against U.S. military bases. I think that the conversation, and I like the fact that we shouldn't demonize other countries. We shouldn't constantly be, having these specters as if they're going to come and attack us. I spoke with a lot of activists all over the world. A lot of people feel that we should sort of ratchet down all the tensions, move away from all of the violent rhetoric that's going on. And I think it's important to really pressure along with this, the not basing the F-35 here. To also say we don't want an expansion of NATO, we don't want to keep interfering in other people's business, we want to go for more peace negotiations all over the world, we want to end the Korean War. All of these things are very important to ratchet. I think it has to be a unified front on all these issues instead of just a particular issue. We have to connect it with all the other issues, whether it's anti-nuclear weapons, and then really the bigger one, which is anti-war. And that's really how I feel about the issue. But I'm very, very happy and very impressed about all the great activism that's going on, and I hope it continues to build, and I'll be working with you all to do that.
Hi, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, I was going to take this back just one question. I appreciate all those sentiments very much. About the jobs issue, that does become a big factor in decision making all over the country. I always love telling this story. I've been in Washington working with the Project Government Oversight for almost 4 years now, and within the first 3-4 months of when I started back in 2015, I was in a meeting on Capitol Hill in Washington with the chief of staff of a lawmaker. And the issue that we were discussing was the A-10. Our organization is big advocates to protect the A-10 because it is a very effective weapon system that didn't break the bank. And so it needs to be protected. If it goes away, then there's all kinds of other implications. But so we advocated on behalf of that, and one of the issues at the time was having a competitive operational fly-off between the F-35 and the A-10. That's what we were in there to discuss. The chief of staff that I was talking to said, look, we love the A-10, we'll do whatever we can to protect the A-10, but you cannot make this an A-10 versus the F-35 issue, because the F-35 is worth 1,000 jobs for us. And that was it. He wouldn't discuss the F-35 at all. He's still very friendly, actually. He's a friend of mine. I still deal with him on a fairly that was a zone where he wasn't willing to go. And I hear that a lot on Capitol Hill in Washington. And they talk about these jobs and a lot of these jobs. I'd be interested to talk to people at that factory because I'm willing to bet that the people who actually build parts for the F-35. One thing, Lockheed Martin is going to claim that job is a full-time job where that person does nothing but build parts for the F-35. I'd be interested to see how many hours in not just a week, but in a year they actually spend building those parts. Because I almost guarantee you that it is just a bare fraction of what it is they really do. But Lockheed Martin is going to claim that for a full-time job, 100% of their time, and use that as propaganda to say, look, you can't cancel the F-35 because if you do, then this guy is going to be out on the street. He's not going to have a job anymore.
Which was Vermont Yankee.
Lockheed Martin has farmed out, I think it's 48 states, or 46 states. So therefore, they've got 46 states that are going to fight for the F-35 because, my God, they'll lose jobs. And that's what we're hearing constantly, that we can't, well, they're claiming that if the F-35 doesn't come, that we'll lose the Guard and lose all those jobs. When there are other perfectly good missions that are cybersecurity, that is the #1 threat we face in our country is cybersecurity. F-35 will do diddly squat for that. And you could get even more jobs out of it, and you could save us. But because the pilots want to fly their planes, and because Lockheed Martin is saying, making the mantra, jobs, 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 that's what makes many politicians fight for an aircraft.
We had a question here.
Two small questions. I don't think I need this. I don't think I need this. Do I need it? Thanks. I just weird holding it in front of my face. So you said, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Right?
Yeah. Chris was talking about, I mean, there's so many threads here for all of us in terms of our old activism, but what to do now is to cooperate, not make demons out of other countries. And I'm remembering during the freeze time, the nuclear freeze in the 80s, some people were going over to Moscow from here, and we were having some exchanges. So, you know, besides the hard work on the ground, there's the international component. I think is also really important because I think most people don't want nuclear weapons or that threat. So that, and have someone say, well, we need it. There's a rationale to it. Is simply a false argument because people don't really believe that. So on a basic level. But I have two small questions, and one is, Ms. Greco, what's your title? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm a retired colonel. You call me Roseanne.
Colonel.
I just use the rank.
No, that's okay, but I don't know your first name. But Colonel, you said you had drawn up some responses to the letter.
Yes, I have a 4-page.
And will you publish that or somehow put it out on email or? Because I think
you know what, we could maybe put it on the website.
or something.
Yeah.
Because I needed to be.
We could put it on the website.
Yeah, good, thank you. And then the other question is, I'm not at all a national politics junkie, and I really hate national politics, but I've been. What?
Yes, and you and me both.
Yeah, I really hate it, but there's a Democrat running, Tulsi Gabbard, who's making it a very big forceful part of her campaign about war and nuclear weapons. So I'm just wondering if there's any thought about that. Not that we should put our hopes in those big games, but I was very impressed with her talking points. Any thought about Tulsi Gabbard? She's a representative from Hawaii.
There are a number of candidates on the Democratic side at this point.
There's a couple, yeah.
Who are speaking up about nuclear weapons. Elizabeth Warren is.
Oh, she is, good.
Has introduced a resolution on no first use in the Senate, and as we've had extensive conversations with her also about the Back to the Brink campaign. We have, Back to the Brink has a very worked out grounding in New Hampshire, in particular, to a lesser degree in Iowa, where we're trying to confront, I guess is the best word, all these candidates every time they appear at a public event and ask them, do they support the Back to the Brink platform for fundamentally changing U.S. nuclear policy? And if not, why not? And our hope is that we can get this enough a part of the conversation that it comes up in debates, that it starts to appear in the press reports, that the candidates have to take a position about what they think about nuclear weapons. The problem we really are dealing with at this point is that people just aren't paying attention to this issue. When they do, they usually come to the right conclusions that we need to get rid of these weapons. But as opposed to the 1980s, when this was on everybody's mind, no one's thinking about this right now. The media doesn't talk about it, the politicians don't talk about it, the popular culture doesn't talk about it in the way that it did back in the 80s. And sort of that's a big part of our job, is just starting this conversation, reminding people that there are all these weapons out there, reminding them how close we've come on how many occasions to using these weapons, reminding them of how incredibly horrible it's going to be if the weapons are used, and getting this to be in the same way that climate change has finally become sort of a mass movement in this country. People in large numbers understand they've got to do something about this. We have to recreate the same understanding about nuclear weapons, and they're closely interrelated in terms of the way that climate change is increasing the danger of nuclear war, as I mentioned earlier, and the fact that the worst consequences of nuclear war are going to be climate disruption. So that there's a real synergy in working on these two issues together, and the climate movement is trying to appreciate that. A number of major climate organizations like 350.org have joined in the Back from the Brink campaign because they really think it's important for people to understand the nuclear dimension to climate change.
Hi. I'm supposed to be, I suppose I'm on the advisory committee, but I just didn't feel like, sorry, I'm nursing a cold. I'm not an expert on this particular issue, so today I just decided to sit and listen to what and learn from what you have to say. And I'm Japanese, and still Japanese, but I've lived in this country longer than I have lived in Japan. And America still represents some of the worst of human nature and the best. And I think I see that a lot in the book. I mean, the best part, I still like the book. and I mean, this is kind of interesting. And so I think it's a brilliant campaign that nuclear bombers, the word, I mean, it's actually a lot bigger than this, the issue of nuclear bomber, this campaign, I think. It's about military-industrial complex and our reliance on that, and then greed, power, and environmental destruction. I think it's a lot bigger than the nuclear bombers thing, but it definitely got my attention, and so that's why I'm here. I decided to take interest in this campaign, and growing up, I learned so much about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, basically atrocities. And 4 years ago, I was at UN interpreting for the victims, survivors of at the review conference of a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So from that suffering perspective, I think I understand what the whole issue is. But how do you change that big machine that's going on in the world? That's been a conundrum for me, because I was so interested in the Fukushima nuclear power disaster. And you have no idea how much money is being poured into Japan from the world's nuclear industry to whitewash the whole thing. And it is, so everywhere you look, you hit a brick wall. And I know this is supposed to be a hopeful thing, and I'm a pretty much hopeful person in general, but I just find that whenever you investigate into this whole military or nuclear thing, you hit a wall, and it's really frustrating. So how do we change that course of humanity? That's my biggest question to you all, but I don't think we just so important. And another thing that I also like to tell people that this is an issue about money. So believe it or not, I didn't know until last month, but Japan already has 15 F-35s deployed, stationed in northern part of Japan, which is not far from my hometown. And I think they're slated to get 105 of F-35A and then 42 F-30B over the course of the next few years. My understanding is that the first aircraft was slated, budgeted to be something like in Japanese, it's a how to translate like $90 million plus million per aircraft. But actually, it was 140 something million per aircraft because they assembled in Japan. And then they said, because it costs so much, now they're not going to make it in Japan. So they're going to import from the United States. Is that correct?
That is correct. There's another aspect of the cost that you need to remember is that buying the aircraft is only one aspect of it. Japan cannot, and none of the countries, can operate the F-35 without, they would probably say the United States, but I'll say Lockheed Martin, because the aircraft operates on a very complicated computer network to manage its logistics. So Japan, for as long as they own and operate the F-35, is going to have to pay Lockheed Martin year by year hundreds of millions of dollars for Lockheed Martin to provide them access to spare parts and to that logistics mainframe.
It's convenient.
No.
Yeah.
Hey, Lockheed Martin, they did their homework when they were putting this together.
Yeah. But you know,
not for your benefit.
The first basically crash happened.
Yes.
Right.
It
What was the
last
second one? There was another one that
Another
crashed.
one?
Yeah,
Oh,
the Marine F-35B crashed in North Carolina in October.
So for the record, last month, April 9th, I think, in that northern Japan, the training F-35 crashed. And they're still looking for the debris, right? But everything is shrouded in mystery because it's secret. So this wasn't a question. I just wanted to say hi and thanks. And I think that's all I wanted to say.
I just want to say a quick comment. Why is Bernie Sanders not a target? He's vulnerable and he should be
Yes.
against this.
He's a hypocrite. And for 7 years, we have been trying to get Bernie to not only just talk to us, but listen to us. He will never meet with us. The few times where he's been someplace and somebody raised a question, he deflects it. He will not respond. He is, he says out of one side of his mouth he's against nuclear weapons and he won't have any nuclear weapons in Vermont, but he staunchly supports the F-35. So I agree. I agree that we need to call him out on that. A lot of people think he's against it because that would align with his public statements. But fortunately, he's for the F-35. He rides to the rescue of the plane against the people.
Some years ago, I helped with a demographic study, a cancer study for Dartmouth Medical School. We would go out to people's homes, mostly older men who had developed the cancer, and we did an epidemiological history of them and took a sample of their water, toenail sample for the nutrition, and blood sample. It was a very good study. It's yielding good results. But occasionally somebody will say, no, you can't take my blood, or I'm not going to do this study. And what stuck out for me was one construction magnate, a very wealthy fellow, who did the study and said at the end, I never ever would have done this study until it happened to me. I got cancer. If I can help somebody else, that changed my mind. That stuck with me because working with racism, working with gender bias, it seemed to me that people had the easiest time changing when they knew somebody personally, when there was a relationship. Margaret Mead spoke at our college way back when, said, if you want to change society, talk to the children of the leaders. They have a relationship.
This isn't a question, either it's a comment. and he was in the military, he was a Navy man, and he wasn't allowed to talk about this for years and years and years. And right after he was allowed to talk about this, he died of cancer. But he was in the Pacific when they were testing the nuclear weapons, and they made all these ships park, which they said was a safe distance away, and they tested a nuclear bomb. Sorry. And my uncle said that they made all the men put their hands up in front of their eyes, and he could see the bones through his hands. And just as soon as he was able to talk about this, because the military wouldn't let him talk about it, he died of cancer. And everyone else on his ship died of cancer soon after he did. So that's a story that happened to an American and some Chinese.
So the issues that are before us have really deep implications for our lives and for the lives of humans around the planet and for life on Earth. And so it does make me feel hopeful when I see that a room full of people is willing to bring their intelligence and their heart to this conversation. And I think one of the big things that we need to do in terms of changing the world to answer Chiho's question is to hold our leadership accountable. Sometimes, like with the conversation with Representative Stevens, his letter is basically quoting things from the Vermont Digger, which you might have read, but also quoting Lockheed Martin, also taking a statement from VTANG. And I think even with him, I sat down, Roseanne and I were talking to him, and I said the same thing that my father said when he stood up to the Secretary of Defense. I said, this project threatens my life, liberty, and my property. And this project threatens my pursuit of happiness. And you're sworn to uphold that. And it's hard for them to come up with an answer to that. But whatever your point is that you make to them, or whatever challenge or roadblock you hit in terms of making a point or getting through to people, I feel like we have such a solid team of advisors who are thoughtful, well-studied, brilliant, and committed. And we're happy to field questions and help you to find the way that you can impact different people. My mom was telling me she has a friend that she talked to who won't be convinced no matter what she says. And this is a friend who goes along with the line of the sound of the plains is the sound of freedom, which is one of the pieces of propaganda that the other side is using. And for me, the sound of freedom is the sound of what I can hear outdoors right now. And so that's what I want to keep hearing, is I want to keep hearing the chirping outside and the voices of people rising up and reminding our elected leaders that this is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Last I checked, it was not a military dictatorship. So when they're saying who they're accountable to, it's interesting that they pick military operations. And we know that they're here to be accountable to us. So please don't hesitate to hold your elected officials accountable. That's the cornerstone of this campaign, and something we're asking everyone to take action on as soon as you can, even if you've already contacted your legislators, to contact them again. When I send out my emails, I'm like, oh no, I'm sending out another email. who might we lose? But the point is that this is a long process, it's a long haul, and even if you can't take action today, you might be the one who can do something tomorrow. And so please do everything that you can in the position that you're in to have these conversations. Sometimes they're tough ones. Like I said to my mom with her friend, I said, sometimes you have to let the people go, some people you won't convince, and turn and look to the person who can, that you can reach, and work with that person to move our effort forward. So I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I don't know if there's any kind of final thoughts, conclusions. There's definitely some good desserts. Like I said earlier, there's some Ben and Jerry's. And I would love to get back a hold of the sign-in sheet, and I'm sure Rachel would love to get her sign-in sheet back. So thank you all again for coming out, and please feel free to linger, and Roseanne has a final comment.
Yeah, one thing I found when we were sitting in Representative Tom Stevens' office that was really powerful is, you know, you can call the Sergeant at Arms, 828-2228, 828-2228, from Tuesdays to Fridays, right? And what he showed me before you got there is he went to his inbox and he took out a stack of these little slips. So when you call 828-2228, you say, hi, my name is Roseanne Greco. I want you to please pass a message to Representative Tom Stevens, asking please to hold hearings and vote on this resolution. That is why Senator White held a hearing, because she was arguing this point with someone when the page came up and gave her a 4-inch stack of these little notes. They're like real tiny. They are visual. And you can send an email, but I can envision Tom Stevens, if we do this right, taking this to the Speaker of the House, Mitzi Johnson, who is telling him not to raise it, and says, but look, I've got a garbage bag full of these. The people have spoken. So, and I've dollars to donate. You could call them multiple times. They're not going to say, no, I saw that name before, right? So, 828-2228.
828-2228.